Chinese envoy to Canada warns Canada against granting asylum to Hong Kong protesters. This is the Great White North Report. Alright, so last week, Kong Pei-Wu dismisses coercive diplomacy claim connected with imprisonment of Spavor and Kovrig in China. This is after the Trudeau government claimed that Spavor and Kovrig were simply arrested as part of hostage diplomacy in order to coerce Canada to release Meng the Merciless Wanzhou in her extradition battle back to China instead of sending her to the United States. Now, the ambassador also warned the Trudeau government not to grant asylum to Hong Kong residents fleeing a widely criticized national security law imposed by Beijing. He says, "We strongly urge the Canadian side not to grant so-called political asylum to those violent criminals in Hong Kong." In a video press conference from the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, he said that would amount to interference in China's domestic affairs and certainly will embolden those violent criminals. Really? They tackled and arrested a 12-year-old girl to the ground. That's a violent criminal. Here she is walking out of a store. She runs because she sees a bunch of stuff and she gets tackled by the police. Jesus. Yeah, she's a violent criminal. The Chinese ambassador is full of it, as is the whole Chinese Communist Party. He should not be able to dictate who we invite in. I am all for allowing Hong Kongers, especially those who lived under the old British system, to move to Canada and bring their families. I'm okay with that, and we should stop people from mainland China from moving to Canada. That's not interfering in China's domestic affairs. Hey, they want out, we're going to give them we have every right to grant them refugee status. They're not violent criminals unless they start bombing stuff, which they haven't. Because after all, the CCP violated the terms of the One Country, Two Systems deal with Britain in 1997, international agreement. And they've been undermining that agreement instead of just waiting patiently. So he goes on to say, if the Canadian side really cares about the stability and prosperity in Hong Kong, and really cares about the good health and safety of those 300,000 Canadian passport holders in Hong Kong and a large number of Canadian companies operating in Hong Kong, you should support those efforts to fight violent crimes. Basically, he's telling us if we don't back down, or if we do support Hong Kong protests and political asylum to the pro-democracy protesters, they're going to take it out of the 300,000 Canadian passport holders. So there'll be more arbitrary arrests and detention of Canadians who live in Hong Kong. And our Canadian companies will also suffer the price. Now, more than ever, I would urge those people in Hong Kong that have Canadian passports to get out, as well as any Canadian companies operating in Hong Kong. Time to get out. Hong Kong is no longer the bastion it once was. Kong, who is a mouthpiece of the CCP, rejected Trudeau's assertion that China is engaging in coercive diplomacy, which is nothing new. And he repeated his government's demand that Canada release Meng immediately, but insisted her case and his government's prosecution of Kovrig and Spavor are not linked. Really, he's demanding the release of Meng. Now, Trudeau could do more to hit back at them and put pressure on them to release the two men, as well as the 4 Canadians on death row, but he won't. And he said that Canada's efforts to get other countries to join its fight for Kovrig and Spavor is doomed to fail. And I totally agree. China will not budge. It's backed itself into a corner, realizing that their hostage diplomacy and coercive behavior have not helped them at all. They backed themselves into a corner and they cannot lose face. Canada has gotten the United States, the European Union to raise concerns, but China does not want anyone to interfere in their internal affairs. And there is no coercive diplomacy on the Chinese side. So Kong is obviously lying, but what can he do? He's just the mouthpiece. So of course they lodge an official complaint with Canada over Trudeau's coercive diplomacy remarks. At the same time, they grant virtual consular access to Canadian Robert Schellenberg, who faces death penalty in China for drug offenses. So they lodge solemn representations with Canada in response to media reports of Trudeau criticizing China over its measures in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Too bad. Cry me a river. We have every right as a country to criticize China for how it handles things. There's a lot to criticize the CCP about. This came during the 50th anniversary of Canada's diplomatic ties with China, and Trudeau attacked Beijing's human rights record. That's all Trudeau does. He attacks their human rights record without actually doing anything about it. He says we'll continue to work with China for advancing Canadian interests and Canadian producers, so he's still trying to get business deals. Canadian companies pressuring him. So we'll remain absolutely committed to working with our allies to ensure that China's approach of coercive diplomacy is arbitrary detention is not viewed as a successful tactic by them. And obviously it's not, it's a failure. The sooner we send Meng to the United States, the better. And he goes on to say that our concern for the protection of human rights in places like Hong Kong, Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs. Response from the Chinese was Zhao Lijian, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, said the Canadian government had shown hypocrisy and weakness. Hey, you don't see 1 million people in a detention center here in Canada. We also have freedom of speech and the freedom of press and a lot of other freedoms. Though lately the cancel culture movement and the social justice warrior nuts have been getting on everyone's nerves. We don't have this. We don't put a million people of an ethnic minority in a prison like this. Canadian Ambassador to China Dominic Barton was granted virtual consular access to Schellenberg because of the provisions in the Privacy Act. The government disclosed no further information. His death sentence was widely seen as part of the punishment for the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. And Canada is asking for clemency. Now, this article conveniently forgot that in Inner Mongolia, which is the northernmost Chinese province, there are threats of arrest, job loss, and surveillance as China targets its model minority. The Mongolians are in a fight right now because China is trying to impose Mandarin in their schools. And China has also demanded a French Museum erase history of Mongols Genghis Khan from exhibit, which they did. Of course, France, 1940, they've gotten used to surrendering, and they surrendered on this one big time. I would have went ahead with it. To hell with them. But anyway, Canadians let me know what you guys think about Hong Kong. Should we allow the pro-democracy activists refugee status in Canada? And should we get our Canadian citizens out of Hong Kong as well as our Canadian companies? And does this girl look like a hardened criminal to you? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. And until next time, this has been the Great White North Report.